Now, how is personality defined? Now, so before we go into the definition, let us remember that how test developers conduct the or constructed their personality tests has to do something with the theories of personality that they patterned their test after. And so it is essential for us to understand the perspective of the specific theory of personality which these test developers pattern their tests after. And so if you still remember your theories of personality, you would understand that there are so many different definitions of personality. And so personality theorists would not agree with just one definition of the term personality. However, for the sake of having a similar, despite their differences, they still have their similarities on how they define personality. And so the main reference, which is Cohen and Swerdlick, define personality as an individual's unique constellation of psychological traits and states. Okay, so this is the definition given by the book. And personality assessment refers to the measurement and evaluation of psychological traits, states, values, interests, attitudes, worldview acculturation, personal identity, sense of humor, cognitive and behavioral styles, and or related individual characteristics. So this is just a brief definition of what personality really is. So some theories would argue that there's no such thing as personality, and some personality theorists will also agree that personality is actually part of the brain circuits, and thus personality is really embedded in our brain chemistry. So there are differences. However, for now, we will stick to this definition. Now, what are the different tools for personality assessment? Now, you may have watched the lecture video on the differences between assessment and testing, but for the sake of review, so we will slightly discuss about the different tools for personality assessment. And so if you remember the first lecture video, so you would now understand that assessment refers to the overall process of gathering of data and integrating those data so you would have a sound understanding of your client, thus enabling you to write psychological reports. So again, psychological assessment helps you to make sound or professional decisions. Okay, so what are the different tools that we use in at least in the context of personality assessment? So again, we have the personality tests, we have intake interviews, we have clinical or structured interviews, we have behavioral observations, and other sources of data. But for this video, we would only discuss the first tool for personality assessment, which is personality tests. Okay. Now, what are the different methods for personality assessment or the different types of personality tests? So we have two. The first one is objective methods, or we can also refer to tests using an objective methods in an objective personality tests. So this method is characterized by short answer items for which the client's task is to select from two or more provided. Now, what are the specific characteristics of objective personality tests? First, they are typically associated with paper and pencil tests, or they could also be computer administered personality tests. So, scoring is done according to set procedures involving little, if any, judgment of the part of a scorer. And so, the reason why it's primarily called an objective test is because scoring is not dependent on the subjective evaluation of the test user or the psychologist or the psychometrician. So again, scoring is based on what is being written in the test manual. And so this is something that we need to understand later on when we ourselves become test users or those handling psychological tests. Now, it is essential for us, you may have understand by now, that um, in order for us to have a sound process of the psychological assessment, we need to adhere to standard process, especially when we use standardized psychological tests. And it is essential for us to always read test manuals, which would help us to know what is the standard way of administering the test, scoring the test, and as well as interpreting the test. And so again, objective methods or the scoring in objective personality tests is done according to set procedures involving little, if any, judgment on the part of a scorer. So it may include items written in multiple choice, true or false, or matching format. So later on, we will see objective personality tests. On the other hand, we have the projective method, which is a technique used by clinical experts who undergone um, substantial educational training, substantial clinical experience and practice, and so this is not a method used by psychometricians. So this is a technique in which judgment of the client's personality is very subjective. Again, because the person handling projective methods should have substantial training and knowledge about this method. Made on the basis of performance on a task that involves applying some sort of structure to unstructured or incomplete stimuli. So the client may be presented stimuli such as ink blots, pictures, words, or even sounds. And so how they will be scored depends on how they would supply answers from these stimuli. Or they could also be asked to produce figure drawings, and then the expert would score the figure drawings based on his or her own subjective judgment. And so again, it is not used, and this will not be discussed for this video. Now, what are the commonly used personality tests? And these are the following that we will be discussing, just a few of what we'll be discussing for this lecture video. So we will discuss about Neo-PI-R, MMPI, 16PF, MBTI, and 2 Filipino personality scales, which are Panukat ng Ugali at Pagkatao at Panukat ng Pagkataong Pilipino. So let's get started. Let's discuss first about Neo-PI-R, or it stands for Neo Personality Inventory Revised. So this is a scale or a measurement tool that provides comprehensive and detailed assessment of adult personality based on the 5-factor model of personality. And because this is patterned after the 5-factor model of personality, and so this scale would also yield scores for the 5 scales or 5 subscales of the 5-factor model, which is the OCEAN: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So again, this is a concise measure of the 5 major domains OCEAN, if you still remember that. And for each domain would also still have 6 facets that define each domain. Okay, so what is the purpose of the Neo-PI-R as a tool for personality testing or personality assessment? So it is used to provide a detailed assessment of normal personality. So later on, there will be some tests or some tests that is primarily used in clinical population, or for those people who are suspected of clinical pathology or psychological concerns. The Neo-PI-R is a paper and pencil test. It is used or administered to clients from age 17 to 89 years old. So take note of the age range where you can use Neo-PI-R. And this test usually takes around 30 to 40 minutes of test administration time. And the Neo-PI-R is a self-administered and is available in 2 parallel versions. Okay, so there are 2 versions of the Neo-PI-R. So each version contains 240 items, 3 validity items, and requires at least a 6th grade reading level. So again, you have to take note about these characteristics about NeoPyR so that this will be used appropriately. So, come a client that doesn't know how to read, then you would know that NeoPyR is not the best tool to measure the personality of that client because, again, it requires a sixth grade reading level. Okay, so what are the two forms of the NeoPyR? So you have the form S, which is designed for self-reports. So this is, you give this to the client so they could answer it by themselves. Appropriate for use with adults, including individuals for college age. The form R, however, is designed for the observer. Reports used by peers, spouse, or expert rating. So this can be used by you as the expert. So it can be used as an alternative or supplement to self-reports. So each item is rated on a 5-point scale, and later on we will see some sample items of NeoPyR. Now, what are the 5 domains? Again, the 5 major domains that NeoPyR measures. So you have neuroticism, which is something to do with adjustment and emotional stability. You also have extroversion, that taps aspects of sociability and assertiveness, openness to experience, active imagination, etc., etc. You also have agreeableness, which is a dimension that has something to do with social relationships or dimension about interpersonal tendencies. And lastly, you have conscientiousness, which is a dimension of personality that involves the active processes of planning, organizing, and following through. So these are again the 5 major domains of NeoPyR. And for each 5 domains, you still have 6 subfacets. So what are the 6 subfacets of each domain? So for extroversion, there are 6. So I wouldn't be reading them one by one. So these are the 6 subfacets. For agreeableness, these are also the subfacets. For neuroticism, you have anxiety, anger, hostility. So again, NeoPyR would yield different scores for the the domains and as well as the different subfacets for each domains. Openness and then for conscientiousness. So what are sample questions of the NeoPyR? So you would have, so again, these are just sample questions. So for example, you'll be asked, I'm seldom apprehensive about the future. And so the client will be rating this from a 5-point scale. So for example, if client 1 would read the first sample question, I'm seldom apprehensive about the future, so the client could rate it from strongly disagree to disagree, and or could be in the other spectrum of the 5-point Likert scale, maybe strongly agree or strong or agree. So again, all of the questions or items of NeoPyR will be rated in a 5-point Likert scale. So these are just a few sample questions for the NeoPyR. And the NeoPyR client profile would look like this. So it's kind of difficult without the test manual. Again, because it's a test manual that would really guide you as to how you should do the client profile when it comes to scoring and interpretation of the client's test. So here's another sample of the client profile. So again, it will be rated if it's high or very low across different domains and of course in different subfacets of the test. Next is the MMPI-2, or we call it the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory 2. So this is the latest version, and we even have a more concise version of the MMPI-2. So it is a psychological test that assesses personality traits and psychopathology. Now, although the MMPI-2 is primarily intended to be used to those who are suspected of a mental health or clinical issues or clinical concerns, this can still be used among clients without any evident psychopathology. So again, this can still be used among normal, healthy individuals. So the MMPI-2, again, it is used for assessing personality traits and psychopathology. And this tool can be administered for clients 18 years and older. So again, this may not be the most appropriate tool when the client is 18 years younger. Okay? Completion time usually takes 60 to 90 minutes of the test taking, and it's quite a long test, no? So it is composed of 567 items. So each items, the clients will just be asked whether it's true of them or not true of them. So they would either answer true or false for each items. Okay. So the MMPI is currently administered in one of two forms. So again, the first one, we have the MMPI-2, which has 567 true or false questions. But we also have the MMPI-2RF, which is the briefer or the more concise, the brief form of the MMPI-2. It only contains 338 true or false items, and test administration or test taking usually just takes around 40 to 50 minutes. We also have the MMPI-A, which is used for clients younger than 18 years old. So this is designed exclusively for teenagers. Again, MMPI is designed with clinical scales, and just because this is used in normal healthy individual, or this will be used in normal healthy individuals, doesn't mean they already have psychopathology. But take note, the scores or the dimensions that MMPI is measuring are clinical scales. So what are the clinical scales? So these are 10 major categories of abnormal human behavior. There are also 4 validity scales to assess whether the person's general test-taking attitude, or whether they answer the items on the test in a truthful and accurate manner. So you would be able to know whether they are answering in random order, they're just shading randomly, or they were not answering the test in a truthful manner. So what are the clinical subscales that MMPI measures? So you have 10, and then you also have 4 validity scales. So let's first discuss about the 10 validity scales. So you have hypochondriasis, you have depression, you have hysteria, you have psychopathic deviate, you have masculinity, femininity. So hypochondriasis has to do something with complaints about bodily functioning. So this may not make sense to you now since you don't have abnormal psychology. Later on, when you take up abnormal psychology, you would have more understanding about these terms. Okay. What else? You have paranoia, psychasthenia, schizophrenia, hypomania, and social introversion. Again, these are the 10 clinical scales that are measured in MMPI-2. Okay, and so even if you would score high on this one, it's not necessarily that you already have the psychopathology, okay, that or you already have the clinical disorder. So again, it will still be validated by other tools of assessment before an expert could really say that you have this psychological disorder. These are also the 4 validity scales that MMPI has. So you have the lie scale, the F scale, the back F scale, and the K scale. So the lie scale is intended to identify individuals who are deliberately trying to avoid answering the MMPI honestly and in a frank manner. So again, MMPI could detect such patterns of responses. The F scale is intended to detect unusual or atypical ways of answering the test items, like if a person were to randomly fill out the test. So again, it also has this subscale to determine whether the client was really answering the test as truthfully as he can. You also have the back F scale, which measure the same issues of the F scale, except only during the last half of the test. And lastly, the K scale designed to identify psychopathology in people who otherwise would have profiles within the normal range. So these are just the four validity scales that MMPI-2 has. So what are sample questions for MMPI-2? So again, each items will be answered with a true or false responses. So for example, you may be asked, I like mechanics magazines, or I have a good appetite. I feel that it is certainly best to keep my mouth shut when I'm in trouble. So you would, answer if it's true or false. Evil spirits possess me at times. There seems to be a lump in my throat much of the time, and a person should try to understand his dreams and be guided by or take warning from them. So again, these are just sample questions. And a client profile could look like this. So there are different profiles for males and females. And so again, it is best if you read the test manual, so you would be guided how to plot the scores of your clients. So there will be certain standards as to how you can plot the scores of your clients, okay? So this is just an example of a female profile on MMPI-2. Next, we have the 16PF, which also stands for 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire. So this is one of the most commonly used tests. It is a comprehensive measure of a normal range personality found to be effective in a variety of settings. So this is used also as a career evaluation tool for couples counseling and, of course, personality assessment. So the 16PF is used for counseling and, of course, personality assessment, and it is used or administered to clients 16 years and older. The reading level requirement is at least fifth grade reading level. Completion time is around 35 to 50 minutes. And so the 16PF can be administered using a computer assisted or computer administered test, or could be paper and pencil. So this is composed of 185 multiple choice items with an additional 26 multiple choice items in the couples counseling report if ever you decided to administer this part of the test for couples counseling assessment. Now, the 16PF again utilizes a multiple choice response format to assess 16 primary skills, hence 16 personality profile. So there are 5 second order scales and 2 third order scales. So what are the different or the 16 factors for 16PF? So it measures 16. So you have warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, social boldness, sensitivity, vigilance, abstractedness, privateness, apprehension, openness to change, self-reliance, perfectionism, and tension. Now, I want you to see, like, on the right side of the factors, you have two different columns. So again, these two different columns represent the interpretation of the client scores on each factor depending on where they fall on the spectrum. So if the client score, at least for the factor A, which is warmth, would fall on the left side, so again, the description would also be on the left side. So if the score of the client for factor A, which is warmth, is on the left part of the spectrum, so again, the client tends to be reserved. Okay, so if the scores again fall on the left side of the spectrum for each factor, so these are the characteristics of that for each factor. Well, if it falls on the right side, so it also refers to these certain characteristics. And so for example, if the client score for factor G, which is rule consciousness, So if the client score falls on the left side, so that means the person, at least for this factor, is expedient. Well, if it falls on the right side, um, it the person means that he or she is consensuous. So what could be the sample questions for 16PF? So questions such as, so there are three options. For example, when talking, I like maybe to say things just as they occur to me, or in between, or to get my thoughts well organized first. And so again, each client will be asked to choose among the three options for each items. And so this is a sample of the client profile. So earlier I mentioned about the 16 factors, no? And again, each score may fall on the extreme left or the extreme right, or just in between the spectrum. And so the interpretation of the client scores would depend on which did the scores fall. Is it just within average, or is it a marked trait on the extreme left or the extreme right? And so it's really essential for us, class, to read the test manual, so we would be guided as to how to properly score and interpret the 16PF. So if we just really had the chance, to go to the laboratory and to see the manual, so we would really see about the whole picture of 16PF and the other tests. Next is the MBTI, or the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator. So this is a tool that provides a constructive, flexible, and liberating framework for understanding individual differences and strengths. So the MBTI profile reveals how we see and interact with the world, giving insight into our motivation and the motivation of others. And MBTI was patterned about the Jung's types, diba? Do you still remember? Extroversion, introversion, and later on you would see that yes, it is patterned after the theory of, some parts of the theory of analytical psychology. So MBTI can be administered in a paper and pencil format. It is composed of 93 questions. So for each question, there will be two choices, which consists of word pairs and short statements. So later on, we will see a sample question for MBTI. Completion time takes around 45 minutes. So again, MBTI would show respondents' preferences on each of four pairs of opposite categories called dichotomies. So there are four dichotomies again, and it's composed of a pair. So what are the four dichotomies? You have extroversion, introversion. You have sensing and intuition. You have thinking and feeling, and judging and perceiving. So these are the concepts discussed in Jung's analytical theory. So again, for each dichotomies, they stand for something. So extroversion stands for this one, introversion stands for this one, and so a client score may fall either of each dichotomy, whether the person tends to be extroverted or introverted, tends to be sensing or tends to be intuitive, or tends to use thinking when it comes to deciding, or coming to a conclusion, or do they use feeling, which refers to this one, or are they into judging or perceiving when it comes to approaching the outside world. Now for each dichotomies, they also have sub facets, so there are 5. So again, extroversion, the dichotomies of extroversion and introversion, which is the attitudes or orientations of energy. So extroversion has 5 subfacets, and the introversion also has 5 subfacets. So for extroversion, you have initiating and expressive. For introversion, you have receiving, contained, continued. For extroversion, you have gregarious, active, enthusiastic. And for introversion, you have intimate, reflective, and quiet. So don't worry, there will be materials provided for you to read in detail for these different theories. So for the dichotomy of processes or perception, functions of process of perception, so sensing and intuition, again, there are still 5 facets. So here are the facets. So the left column refers to the facets for sensing, while the right refers to the facets of intuition. So here's the continuation for sensing. You have practical, experiential, and traditional. You also have for intuition, conceptual, theoretical, and original. So again, these are the different subfacets for each dichotomy. Same goes for thinking and feeling. Again, there are five facets. So for thinking, you have logical and reasonable. For feeling, you have empathetic and compassionate. And for continuation, thinking, questioning, critical, and tough. For feeling, you have accommodating, accepting, and tender. And lastly, for the judging, perceiving dichotomy, again, there are five facets. So you have systematic for judging and planful for judging. You also have casual and open-minded for perceiving. And lastly, again, still a continuation of the dichotomy. For judging, you have early starting, you have scheduled and methodical, while for perceiving, you have pressure prompted, spontaneous, and emergent. So again, these are the facets under each dichotomy. So what could be, or what are sample questions for MBTI? So clients may be asked items such as, which is more of a complement? They choose either A, there is a very logical person, or B, there is a very sentimental person. Or next item, common sense is A, rarely questionable, B, frequently questionable, or do you tend to be more A, deliberate than spontaneous, or B, spontaneous than deliberate? So clients will be asked to choose from either of these two options. And so here's a sample of an MBTI sample client profile. Again, the client score would fall either at the end of the dichotomy. So for extroversion introversion dichotomy, for at least for this client, it falls under the extroversion side or dichotomy. Then for sensing and intuition, it's more on the intuition side. Then so it's on the very clear nga kuan sa kaning dichotomy. For um, thinking and feeling, so it's leaning towards the feeling dichotomy. And then for judging and perceiving, it's really on the perceiving side. Okay, so that's for MBTI. Now let's discuss about a Filipino personality test. So panukat ng ugali at pagkatao, or in short, PUP. So this is a psychological measure that is used again for personality testing, but could also be used for research, recruitment, and or admission in an institution. So it's very useful, a useful tool for these fields as well. So PUP is a paper and pencil administration, and this is a 160 item tests. So it both has Filipino and English translations. There are 141 items organized into the 24 trait scales or the main scales. There are also two validity scales similar with the MMPI, plus 19 items designed to assess culturally relevant behaviors and attitudes. So we will discuss further about these three major scales. So each item uses a 5-point bipolar scale. So the scale in Filipino is rated from hinding hindi, hindi, walang masabi, totoo or totoong totoo. Okay, so the PUP has forms A and B, so this can be scored manually or it can be computer scored. Completion time for PUP takes around 30 to 45 minutes. And so what are the different scales measured by this personality test? So again, there are 24 scales for this one. So there are 24. So you have ambition, coyness, or unapproachability. You have thriftiness. You have perseverance. You have guts or daring. You have thoughtfulness. You have respectfulness, shyness, creativity, generosity, You also have humility, self-control or restraint, criticalness, sensitiveness, helpfulness, inquisitiveness, belligerence, low tolerance for teasing, responsibleness, fickle mindedness, non risk taking, excessive conformity, moodiness, and stubbornness. So, again, these are the four personality skills measured by PUP. Now, how about for the two validity skills? So, what are the two validity skills and what are they for? So, these skills indicate a respondent's tendency to one, deny basic truths or pagkakaila, and two, to reject cultural values typically held by Filipinos or kaugalian. Now, what happens um, when they are detected to to deny basic truths or to reject commonly held cultural values? So, when a test taker's responses on items belonging to these two skills indicate these response tendencies. So, his or her responses on the rest of the items are no longer analyzed or interpreted. If ever the client endorsed, tends to deny basic truths and to reject cultural values typically held by Filipinos. So these are validity checks. And lastly, there are additional 19 items designed to assess culturally relevant behaviors and attitudes for use as criterion variables in personality research. So it tackles about gambling behavior, drinking behavior, praying behavior, and accident proneness. So these are 19 items measuring these four culturally relevant behaviors. What could be sample questions of PUP? So again, it will be rated in 5 bipolar scale from hinding hindi, hindi, walang masabi, totoo or totoong totoo. So an item could be like, lagi kong nagagawa ng mahusay ang kahit anong trabahong ibigay sa akin. So the client would again rate from the 5-point scale, or lagi akong matagumpay sa aking ginagawa, and palagi akong masaya. So again, these are just sample questions of PUP. Lastly, we have the Panukat ng Pagkataong Pilipino or the PPP. So again, this is another personality test. Filipino personality test which assesses 19 traits mostly used with adults. So it is used for research, screening for employment, screening for acceptance into programs, and even for counseling. So even if this is used for adults primarily, so it can be administered to clients as young as 13 years old and above. So PPP is composed of 210 items that assesses 19 traits. Okay, so this is available in both Filipino and English translations. Now, the test itself usually takes around 50 minutes to an hour. Okay, take note of that. So, furthermore, the 19 traits of PPP, again, are clustered into three forms. So, you have Porma K, which includes traits salient for interpersonal relations. Porma S includes personal traits, and Porma KS is an intelligence or creativity cluster. So let's discuss about the different facets under each forms. So for Porma K or Form K, it has 90 items. And again, these are dimensions that measures interpersonal relationships. So you have pagka-maaalahanin or thoughtfulness. You have pagkamadaldal or social curiosity, pagkamagalang or respectfulness, pagkamaramdamin or sensitiveness, pagkamasunurin or obedience, pagkamatulungin or helpfulness, pagkamaunawain or capacity to be understanding, and pagka pagkapalakaibigan or sociability. So again, these dimensions measures interpersonal relationships. How about for Form S or Porma S? Again, these are dimensions that measures personal traits. Traits such as pagkamaayos, which is orderliness, pagkamahinahon or emotional stability. You have pagkamapagkumbaba or humility, pagkamasiyahin or cheerfulness, pagkamatapat, honesty, pagkamatyaga, patience, and pagkaresponsable or responsibility. And lastly, you also have the Forma KS, which is a 40 item, composed of 40 items all in all, that measures intelligence and creativity. So you have pagkamalikhain, creativity. You have makapagsapalaran or risk-taking, pagkamasikap or achievement orientation, and of course, pagkamatalino or intelligent. So these are just the different facets of the personality test PPP. Okay? And that ends the first part of our lecture video. So we will have another video that talks about different ability tests. So thank you for listening.